So, I've had some thoughts about the so-called next evolution of D&D ever since it was announced, and I finally feel like putting it into words. Now, all of this predicates on the idea that we're actually gonna see a significant expansion. For all I know, we might just get some new cover art, an apology for the original Ranger, and no new mechanical content other than what we've already seen in other sourcebooks. But I really don't think that'll be the case. By the time this project releases, it'll have been at least 3 whole years in the making, so it's gotta be something pretty substantial. At the same time, WotC has said that this new version is gonna be backwards compatible with the existing 5e books, so it won't be an entirely new edition in the traditional sense. There are a million different directions they could take this thing, and whatever they choose, I'll probably be glad there'll be more ways to play the game. But I'd be especially excited to see any of these 7 changes. The entries on this list are in rough order of how easy they are to implement, starting with something that'll only take 1 sentence, and ending with something that's pretty drastic, but still possible. My first suggestion is very simple, and it's one that many of you have probably thought of already: a free feat at level 1. It's safe to say that feats ended up being more important, more powerful, and more interesting than Wizards intended when they first released the game. In the original PHB, feats were just an optional rule that they didn't expect most people to use, but I've never played at a table that didn't use them. And for good reason. Feats are a nice way to flesh out your character's abilities beyond their mostly pre-packaged class features. They're also very powerful for certain builds, to the point where Variant Human is almost universally considered to be the strongest race in the game. If everyone got a free feat out of the gate, characters would be more balanced and personalized. In general, feats just seem like they should be available to low-level characters, since so many of them represent personality quirks or relatively mundane professional backgrounds. It feels kinda weird to not let anyone be proficient in non-magical first aid until 1 level before the cleric learns their first resurrection spell. With this new system, variant humans could still exist, but they would just start with 2 feats instead of 1. That would still be attractive to many players, but the majority would still have reasons to consider choosing another race. My second suggestion is to give intelligence a purpose. I've mentioned in a previous video that dexterity, constitution, and wisdom are far more useful to most characters than strength, intelligence, or charisma. But at least strength and charisma are primary attack or spellcasting stats for several classes each. With intelligence, unless you're a wizard or artificer, there's pretty much no reason to give yourself anything above a 10. Sure, it's useful for a handful of skills, and intelligence saves are occasionally important, but it's hard to justify prioritizing it over constitution or wisdom without putting yourself at a clear disadvantage. 3rd edition had an excellent use for intelligence, determining your character's skill points per level. Obviously, 5th edition doesn't use this exact system, but it could still tie intelligence to skill proficiency in some other way. Maybe they could make your int mod determine the number of skill proficiencies, changing backgrounds so that they only give you extra skills as an option instead of forcing you into them. Or maybe they could just move some other skills to key off intelligence, or allow for some non-wizards to use it as their spellcasting stat. I'm sure there's at least one WotC employee who didn't dump their own int enough to see no use for it. My 3rd suggestion is to make it so that short rests are about equally useful to every character. Some parties take a lot of short rests, some will almost never take them, and most are somewhere in between. The massive variety here isn't great when there are classes like warlocks and monks that rely disproportionately on short rests to get the most out of their abilities. In most campaigns, these classes get the short end of the stick, since dungeon grinds are falling out of fashion, and if the PCs can rest for an hour, they can usually rest for 8 hours. In my games, short rests just don't happen very often, but I recognize that some tables use them more frequently. So the best solution is to keep them around, but make sure they give fairly modest benefits to every character, instead of making them crucial to some and inconsequential to others. Fourth on the list is cool stuff for martial characters, especially at higher levels. To some extent, 5e does a good job legitimizing martial characters by reining in the power of magic, at least compared to earlier editions. But it still doesn't really recognize that after low levels, the goal isn't to let normal skilled dudes keep up with wizards, because martial characters are not normal skilled dudes. By 7th or 8th level, martial characters are beyond even most action movie heroes, and are well within superhero or shonen anime territory. A 7th level fighter can shoot 4 arrows in a single round, or easily fight off a dozen guards with barely a scratch. Yet, in some ways, it seems like the designers still want them to feel normal. Movement speed and lifting capacity rarely improve as characters level, and the champion feature Remarkable Athlete only gives a 5-foot bonus to jumping distance at most. That's a far cry from the superhuman leaps I'd expect from someone who can survive a blast of dragon's fire. You just can't expect high-level martials to feel like scrappy underdogs, at least not while hit points and extra attacks work the way they do. If you don't want to change the hit point system, which I'll get into later, my advice is to lean into the implications. Make martial characters feel more and more like mythological demigods as they gain levels. Not only does it fit the atmosphere of high-level D&D, it allows for more player options both in and out of combat. On this topic, there's also room to give more depth to even low-level martials, and this is actually much easier. Just take the optional combat rules from the Dungeon Master's Guide and make them official. I made a whole video on those variant rules, and I had nice things to say about pretty much all of them. Fifth on the list is a sort of alternative to superpowers for martial characters, and that's better hit point scaling. When I first started playing 5th edition back in 2014 or so, one of the things that really struck me was how exciting and dangerous the combat felt. And that was largely because the characters started with only a dozen or so hit points at most. Until then, I was playing 4th edition, where characters could have upwards of 30 hit points even at level 1. Characters could tank sword strike after arrow after fireball without breaking a sweat, and the fights didn't feel real. I couldn't picture believable fantasy characters engaging in deadly conflicts. I could only picture action figures slamming into each other with health bars slowly plinking away. But in 5th edition, when I was sneaking through the Kragmaw hideout, it was actually scary because I knew one goblin's arrow could potentially take me out. Unfortunately, this feeling is mostly gone after around level 4, when characters once again have a mountain of hit points. 5th edition did a great job cutting down on the tedious number climb of 3rd and 4th edition when it comes to AC and attack rolls, but it mostly drops the ball with hit points and damage. Sure, your extra attacks prevent combat from being unbearably long, and I said before that by mid-level, D&D characters are basically demigods with superhuman toughness. But even a CR2 Berserker has 67 hit points. If you're still fighting relatively normal dudes and a critical hit will barely phase a level-appropriate enemy, it feels like you're swinging around a pool noodle. I don't have any super specific ideas for how to make combat feel dangerous at every level, but I also don't think it's an unreasonable ask when there are so many other games with better damage systems. Whether they increase weapon damage by level, impose negative conditions when characters run low on health, or drop hit point scaling entirely in favor of a parry or evasion mechanic, I trust WotC to find a way. Still, I feel like this might be too drastic a change for a revised version of 5th edition as opposed to an entirely new edition, so now I should probably mention something that doesn't involve changing the rules at all. Number 6 is a better Dungeon Master's Guide. Good god, this thing is just not a good resource for new DMs. I could make a whole video about this, but overall, it just gives the wrong ideas of what to focus on. You open the first chapter with a barrage of information on how to create a pantheon and world map, which really don't matter for most campaigns, followed by only a single page about different playstyles. Then we get a long section about creating a multiverse, which is even less useful, followed by a quick description of various subgenres without any advice on how to actually run them. More on that later. The book is really just lacking in actual good advice on how to run a fun game for your players. And what little there is cut short by undercooked mechanics like Renown and Planescape lore dumps that really belong in a sourcebook, or at least the back half of the guide. I know that when I was a new DM, I was totally led astray by this book, spending way too much time coming up with gods and kingdoms and basically forgetting to plan an adventure that involved the players. Really, if I have to request one thing from the new DMG, it's to specify that nothing there is essential. You don't need to roll on a table to see if carrots go extinct, you don't need to use a hex map to track movement, and characters above 8th level don't need to exist in your setting if it doesn't fit the style or subgenre you're going for. Finally, speaking of subgenres, one change that might be too much to ask for, but could revolutionize the scope of the game, is to go into far more depth with the idea of different mechanics for different styles of gameplay. Ideally, we wouldn't really need this. D&D is good at what it's made for, and there are a ton of other systems for other genres. But as long as D&D is the only system that approaches mainstream popularity, there will be tons of people who use it to run campaigns that it wasn't really made for. And these people will have a better time if they have optional rules to support their ideas. Some groups want magic to be fairly rare, and could benefit from less overtly magical versions of the Paladin, Ranger, or even Bard. Since these groups would probably want to stick to lower levels, I could also see some room for new non-magical classes that cap at around 5th level, like Artisan, Leader, or Sage. Some other groups might want to play in a world with Bronze Age or Industrial technology, which would require a new table of weapons and armor. Some groups might want their campaign to involve lots of political intrigue, which might call for an actual system for influence and parlay beyond just rolling persuasion and hoping for the best. With Strixhaven's slice of life and relationship mechanics, WotC is already starting to cater to groups who aren't focused on dungeon crawling and monster slaying, and I think they should go even further in these directions. Still, I honestly won't be too disappointed if we don't see any subgenre-specific mechanics in the new core books. Not only because it's a big ask, but also because it's the perfect material for a source book. And that's about it. As I said before, it's not like I'll only be happy if I see these changes. There are a million ways for this new version to potentially turn out great, although to be fair, it's still very possible that it'll just be a cash grab with hardly any original content. But I'm optimistic that we'll see some serious new direction. What do you all think? Are you skeptical that we'll see anything new? Is there any specific change you'd like to see? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see any more videos like this, a like is always appreciated. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you all next time.